There are a few popular sewing techniques that may not turn out perfect from the first try. So in this video, I want to share a breakdown of 5 popular sewing techniques, how you can easily recreate them using any sewing machine that you have. This video is created in partnership with Mettler, manufacturer of high-quality threads. So let's begin with one of my personal favorite sewing techniques, and it's shirring. With shirring, we take the simple fabric and gather it using elastic thread to create this gorgeous elastic gathers. Now, to sew shirring technique, let's go ahead and mark straight lines on the right side of the fabric. Now, on our sewing machine, at the top, we're going to use a standard sewing thread that matches the color of our fabric. Now, for the bobbin, we're going to use a special elastic thread which will create those beautiful gathers. I'm using Mettler elastic thread. This is my favorite elastic thread for shirring. I've been using it exclusively for the 5 years. It has great stretch and great recovery, and I have applied it on multiple different garments, and even after lots of washes and lots of wears, this thread keeps its elasticity. Now, to wind the bobbin with elastic thread, we cannot use automatic winding function on our sewing machine, and instead we need to wind the bobbin by hand. Here, the important part is that when you're winding the bobbin, the thread has to be winded very loosely and not tense. Next, we're going to install the bobbin into the sewing machine, and here important part is to always install it properly, because sometimes, because of the elasticity of the thread may jump back into the bobbin, so you definitely want to pay attention and thread the bobbin properly. Now, before sewing, we're going to pull out the bobbin thread to the top so that we can start sewing right away. On your sewing machine, you're going to sew using a standard straight stitch. Now, the stitch length depends on how many gathers you want to create. The longer stitch you're using, the more gathers you will create. Now we're going to place the fabric with the right side facing upwards, and we're going to start sewing following the drawn lines. Begin and end seam with the back stitches. And this is it. This is how you can create this beautiful shirring effect. You can create very different looks by adding multiple rows of shirring, or you can even cross them to create the honeycomb shirring. So if this technique is not turning out right, here are a few things that I recommend doing. First of all, I want you to go ahead and use a high quality elastic thread. I'm using Mettler elastic thread because I've tried it multiple times and it always works. Next, you want to make sure that you are using this technique on light to medium weight fabrics that have a very drapey, flowy look. If you want to create this technique on heavyweight fabrics, sturdy fabrics, it simply won't work as good or won't work at all. And third, lastly, sometimes in very rare cases, you may need to adjust the tension of the bobbin. Now, I want you to look at the manual of your sewing machine to see exactly how to do that on your sewing machine, but sometimes this may be the issue why the machine is not feeding the thicker elastic thread properly, and by loosening the tension of the bobbin thread, you may create this beautiful technique well and easy. Shirring is very simple, very easy technique, and it's one of my absolute favorites, and I highly recommend giving it a try. Now, in this next technique, I want to show you how to sew alternative shirring method, and this technique will work if you want to work with medium to heavyweight fabrics, or even fabrics that are not as drapey. So here, instead of the elastic thread, we are going to use elastic tape. So very similarly as to previous shirring version, we're going to draw straight lines, but this time we're going to draw the lines on the wrong side of the fabric because we are going to sew from the wrong side of the garment. Next, I want you to go ahead and thread your sewing machine with the standard universal sewing thread. We're going to use the same thread at the top and bobbin, and you may want to match the color of the thread to the color of your fabric. So now we're going to place the fabric with the wrong side facing up under the presser foot, and we're going to position elastic to go on top of the beginning of one of the lines we've drawn. Lower the presser foot, pull the needle down, and do a few back stitches to secure the beginning of the seam. Next, I want you to go ahead and keep the end of elastic at the end of the seam and pull the elastic elastic to fit in the fabric. Now, the elastic length is going to depend on how many gathers you want to create. If you want to create a lot of gathers, let's go ahead and cut the elastic much shorter than your fabric. If you want to just barely gather the fabric, then you want to cut the elastic a little bit longer, but still a little bit shorter than your fabric. So next, using the straight stitch, we're going to pull the elastic to fit in the fabric, and we're going to sew a straight stitch following the drawn line. Once you sew the seam from the right side of the garment, we have created these beautiful gathers, and from the inside of the garment we have securely attached the elastic. Now, what I like about this method is that it allows us to predict the total length of the sheared garment piece, because we are the ones cutting the elastic, so we know how long we're going to cut it. And also, I do like this method because it allows to gather even thicker fabrics and even sturdier fabrics. It is not as fast as the first technique that I showed you, but it's definitely a good technique to know and have in your sewing toolkit. So this next technique is about sewing with twin needle, and here I want to show you one very interesting step that I get asked a lot whenever I show it on my social media channels. So to sew using a twin needle, first we're going to install the twin needle on our sewing machine. So here a few things to note is that same as standard universal sewing needles, the twin needles have different thickness depending on the thickness of your fabric. They also have different options for sewing wovens and sewing knit fabrics. So if you're sewing knit fabrics, you would like to choose the twin needle that is suitable for sewing stretch fabrics. Not only that, but twin needles also vary by the width between the needles. So here we have to think about what design you're creating and what distance between the needles you want in your final result. So for this technique, after you have installed the needle, let's go ahead and install two matching threads at the top. Here we are using same universal sewing threads. If you don't have two spools of the same thread, an alternative would be to wind a spare bobbin and use it instead of the second spool. Now we're going to take two threads and thread the sewing machine with both threads at the same time, as if we would be using one thread. Now, once we're moving towards the needle, we're going to separate those threads. We're going to thread the left needle, same as you always thread, and we're going to thread the right needle by skipping the needle bar. By skipping the needle bar, we're separating these two threads and they won't tangle. Now we're going to select a straight stitch, and if you're working with the computerized sewing machine, you may want to select the twin needle function, which will lock all stitches that are not available when sewing with this needle, so it's an extra safety step. Now we're going to place the fabric with the right side facing up and simply start sewing. So from the right side of the garment, with this technique we get 2 rows of straight stitches, and at the bottom we should be seeing a zigzag stitch. Because of the zigzag stitch, the seam is elastic and you can apply it even when working with knit fabrics. This is why it's one of my favorite ways how to hem knit garments. So this technique is actually very simple, but I do want to talk about the troubleshooting if this technique does not work. And in most cases, if you don't see that zigzag, that nice zigzag at the bottom, you may want to adjust the thread tension. First, you're going to adjust the upper thread tension. Now remember, if you're increasing the tension, and let's say we're selecting the maximum tension, you will get this bump at the surface of the fabric. So if you're starting to see the bump, you may want to decrease the tension of the top thread. Alternatively, if you're still not seeing the zigzag underneath, you have played around with the upper thread tension, you may want to check the bobbin thread tension and adjust it as well. Now, this is again very rare case where you have to adjust the bobbin thread tension, but if you're struggling working with this technique, if it doesn't turn out and you have tried different stitch variations, different stitch length, different upper thread tension, you may want to adjust the bobbin thread tension and see how it affects the result. I use twin needle all all the time when working with knit fabrics, and mastering this technique is definitely worth it. So now that I've talked about sewing knit fabrics, one question I get asked a lot is how to sew knit fabrics without a serger. So I'm going to show two techniques of how you can easily do that. So for the first technique, I want you to go ahead and select one of the overcast stitches that may be available on your sewing machine. Now these stitches may look quite different, but they all create a strong, durable, and most importantly, elastic stitch. On our sewing machine, we also want to install the needle that is suitable for sewing knit stretchy fabrics. Now because the overcast stitch is going to use a lot of thread, more than the standard straight stitch, I'm going to use a bigger spool of thread at the top. Now this particular Mettler spool has 1000 meters of thread on it, and it can be very easily be used on any domestic sewing machine without a need of an extra spool stand. The next step is attaching the overcast presser foot. Now this particular presser foot is optional, but it does improve the results, and if you're planning on sewing a lot of knit garments on your sewing machine, I definitely recommend investing in this presser foot. Now this presser foot in the middle has this bar that protects these stitches from being pulled, and at the bottom it has a fin that allows us to easily navigate the seam edge. So now you will want to go ahead and position your fabric under the presser foot so that the fabric edge goes along the fin of the presser foot, and then you simply start sewing using the overcast stitch. Now because of that bar in the middle, you can very easily see how it protects the stitches from being pulled, and thus you get the very nice edge of the fabric. And also because of the fin, it makes it so much easier to always follow the edge of the fabric and sew the seam precisely at the same distance from the edge. This is how the stitch looks finished. It's very durable, very strong. The overcast stitch protects fabric from fraying and also creates an elastic seam. Using this stitch, you can create lots of designs. For example, this sweatshirt is solely sewn using this overcast stitch combined with the straight stitch at some parts, but it didn't use serger. This is the sweatshirt that I show how to make a pattern and sew at my knitwear sewing and pattern making course. In this course, we're using our body measurements to create different patterns for t-shirt, sweatshirt, and fitted dresses such as turtleneck dresses. If you want to create your own knitwear wardrobe, I will link the course in the description box down below. Now in this final technique, I'm going to show you how to sew knit fabrics without the serger and without stretch stitches. This is actually one of the questions that I got after one of my Instagram videos, where a viewer asked if she can instead use a zigzag because her machine does not have elastic stitches. Now if we're using zigzag, the problem is that the moment we open two layers of the fabric, the stitch stretches out and creates a visible ladder stitch instead of an elastic seam. So I want to show you a better version how to sew this stitch if you have a sewing machine that doesn't have stretch stitches. So first and foremost, we're going to thread our sewing machine using elastic thread. I'm going to use Mettler Flex thread that has a higher elasticity compared to standard sewing thread. Because of that elasticity, we're going to be able to sew stretch knit fabrics, and the seam won't break when stretched out. Now, contrary to elastic thread, this thread goes into the top and also bobbin. So we're going to use it as a standard sewing thread. Now, on your sewing machine, you may want to reduce the thread tension just a little bit so that the thread goes into the seam, not tense, thus ensuring the maximum elasticity. Now, using a standard straight stitch, we're going to sew a seam about 6 millimeters from the fabric edge. Next, we're going to rethread our sewing machine using all-purpose sewing thread, and now we're going to finish the edge using the zigzag stitch. Typically, I like to use a wide zigzag, and we're going to sew about 1 millimeter from this straight seam we made previously. After this is all done, we have created a mock overlock stitch using a standard straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. Now, because we use elastic thread to sew the straight stitch, our seam is fully elastic, and when we open both layers of the fabric, we do not get that ladder stitch effect. So this is a great alternative if you don't have a serger or your sewing machine does not have straight stitches. I hope you enjoyed the breakdown of these 5 popular sewing techniques, and let me know which one is your favorite. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you next time. Bye!